Okay, this is the last chapter of this course. I might add some stuff from solutions from sources like Drawdown. I don't know if you heard of it. So let's see how it goes. The last chapter is really on society's response and knowledge gaps. As a physical scientist, I like when the social scientists point out these knowledge gaps and literally take us to task for some of the communication issues in terms of assuming that we're always talking about science when we actually tend to drift towards advocacy, and that can create some issues and could be in the worst case become a credibility problem. So let's see some of those things in this chapter. So we are looking here at society's need for the knowledge that Earth system science can provide, which are obviously urgent. But the challenges of knowledge integration and application are substantial. So the way I think about it, climate change is as a physical science, biological, biogeochemical science with human interactions, which we are trying to model, because when you want to look at the future, you need models to produce projections and then worry about reliability of these projections, uncertainties in them, the scenarios, etc., and the time scales at which the information is needed, and the spatial scales at which action, especially adaptation, actually happens. And then the hard decisions are actually made by social scientists on the street. It's not so much a physical scientist necessarily making the last mile connection to humans, society, behavioral problems, and so on. So there's a similar chapter with a slightly different focus from Bending the Curve that I'm going to link up here as well. So in this last chapter, we explore some of the issues that arise while moving forward with the Earth system science applications, which was the focus. So let's start by looking at what has now become common in terms of looking at conflicts, armed and civil conflicts across the world, and trying to see what the climate stressors are. As I said before in another context, climate change is never necessarily the proximal cause, the immediate cause for conflicts, but it kind of tips things over. It adds a stress at the wrong place to lead into conflict. So these are examples from Bangladesh, Mexico, China, India, and Pakistan, and the Philippines, who have been sending lots of immigrants elsewhere, Australia, Europe, US, and so on. And the Levant, which is the Middle Eastern, Syrian, Israeli, that region, has experienced massive population shifts. The Gulf states, Germany and the US, continue to experience a net influx of immigrants from Central and South American states, various African countries, and so on. These population shifts on the surface are attributed to political and economic triggers, while extreme climate events and environment to some extent have probably undergirded the socio-political upheavals. So there also the question is of detection and attribution, and we will see some differences between the way natural scientists think about attribution and the social scientists, because social scientists put everything in terms of narratives of the problem itself is wrapped up in the narrative of how it is attributed, if that makes sense. So 1970s, Bangladesh, India had a conflict, Ethiopia to Somalia, migration driven by famine and conflict, 80s, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, famine and war. So let's just look at this column here, and you can look at these various times, decades, and regions. So transient cessation of conflict, U.S. policy changes, so emigration to USA was affected. Economic growth, labor demand, civil conflict, political dissidence, and war. In the emigration to Spain from various regions. Oil and gas discovery, emigration to Russia. Let's see. So the Rohingya genocide, there is some evidence or some research that indicates that there are environmental issues involved there in terms of resource limitations. So unresolved issues in terms of societal responses and knowledge gaps. Let's start with just the way climate change has become a key player in the public debates. You cannot open any news anywhere in print, online, or on WhatsApp or TV, etc., without hearing about climate stories. And this is playing a big role because media often looks for sound bites of impending catastrophic changes that will only make everything worse. Is this a good narrative? Not everybody agrees. This chapter in fact says that's not a good idea at all, and there is indication that that kind of alarmist messages have made especially children anxious about climate. So can action come out of anxiety? Does it lead to the freeze reaction or fight or flight reaction? And where is the good energy for solutions and collective action going to come from? Those are serious issues. So people who get on the media and amplify a cyclone or a flood with immediate claims about more of this coming are often stepping little over from what is happening to interpreting things in a quite a liberal way to make sound bites. Okay, so politicization and media profile of climate science, looking at demerit, which is quoted in the book, who's quoted in the book, in the highly adversarial context of climate change, of the climate change debate. The values of openness, disinterestedness, and good faith upon which science depends are quickly suspended. Disinterestedness is kind of the dispassionate interest or passionate disinterest, however you want to say, to use the words from Bhagavad Gita. So it's supposed to lead to some kind of objective exploration. Of course, all science happens in a value framework, and we have to be careful about that. Personal motives are subjected to corrosive scrutiny and expert judgments discounted out of hand as competing groups seek to advance their own interests by deconstructing opposing claims in the media or on the witness stand. So there is room for controversy all the time. Fortunately, interested skepticism about the science of climate change, paid for by the fossil fuel industry, is largely restricted to the political culture of the United States. So we'll see that US tends to have lots of difficulties in dealing with climate change. As you know, it got out of Paris Agreement, but now Joe Biden will hopefully bring it back in full force. It's difficult to see how this very cynical and deeply interested campaign to discredit the science of climate change is either reflexive, which means reflective essentially, contemplative, or enlightened, right? So those are kind of the issues we will consider. To add one more point there, coming back to the PowerPoint, scientists tend to be very wary of people who express contrary opinions, even in a very honest scientific debate. Okay, so closing ranks is a kind of what tends to happen, where everybody just supports something that was said as let's say by a climate scientist in a context of what climate is responsible for. Could be just a hurricane season, for example, and even if a legitimate science query was raised, could be immediate attacks to close ranks behind the scientists. So then controversies tend to be downplayed, which can be counterproductive. It excludes the public from insights into how science really advances and the controversies that go on behind the scenes. So science advances by controversies, disagreements, trying to prove what is right and what is wrong, collecting data to build hypotheses, convert them to theories, get more data to confirm the theories. So these are never linear steps. Often there are non-linear steps, misadventures, wrong directions. So people can learn a lot by knowing what went wrong instead of just looking at a paper or a report thinking it was just very non-linear process from the beginning to the end. So people should be aware that it's complicated business, that there are disagreements, there are controversies, but that science always seeks to address the controversies and the reasons behind the controversies and tries to resolve controversies. So especially for a field like climate change, where socioeconomics and everything we do is likely to be a part of the climate change story. So people can overreact, but scientists shouldn't overreact, right?